it tells me that it started. All right, so welcome everyone. We're so excited for our event tonight. We are with the park rangers at Independence National Historic Park at the Edgar Allan Poe Home. I lived there for about 6 years. Sarah was just telling me, so I would like to introduce you to Sarah and Paul. And, I'm going to turn things over to them. I am putting an agenda in the chat, and you may want to open that up because I think that they are going to refer to some things and may ask you to go to some different items on that agenda. And I will turn it over to you, Paul and Sarah. Thank you so much.
Okay, good evening out in Zoom land. Yes, I am Paul. Joining me is Sarah, and we are park rangers here in Philadelphia. And right now we are at the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site. We're in a neighborhood of Philadelphia referred to as Northern
This
Liberty.
meeting is being recorded.
And we're not actually too far away from the historic district of the city. In fact, on a good day, I think of it as being quite walkable. I do want to start off with a question though, and feel free to drop it in the chat here. Sarah's going to be controlling the chat from our end. And that question is, who has been here before, if anybody? Any
let's take
positives there?
I know we had a few folks who said they were close by before, but I don't know whether we got anybody who's
so everybody's seeing it for the first time.
No one been there to the Edgar Allan Poe House in Philadelphia?
Okay.
Not yet. That's okay.
Yeah, we're coming this summer. No, we're going to come see you.
Yeah. One thing that I certainly hope that our presentation will do here is maybe, among many things, perk your curiosity to visit. A lot of great things here to see Philadelphia, and certainly Edgar Allan Poe should be on the list there. Now, right now we're standing on the south side of the house. The site is right over here, as you can see. Now, what you see today is one very large house, would have been two separate residences back at the time that Edgar Allan Poe actually lived here. So his neighbor's house, Poe's neighbor's house, as well as his own house, were combined into one house. But I also want to kind of get an idea before we delve into it a little bit more deeply, just what exactly you know about Edgar Allan Poe and what your impressions are. So what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think Edgar Allan Poe? When you hear that name, Edgar Allan Poe?
The Raven.
The Raven, of course.
The Raven. Oh. Did you catch that on the camera?
Yes. Oh, we got Annabelle Lee.
Annabelle Lee. All right.
Telltale Heart. Of course, many Telltale Hearts. Follow the House of Usher. Lots of Telltale Hearts.
Okay.
More Raven.
Cask of Amontillado.
Oh,
Cask of Amontillado. Excellent.
It and the Pendulum.
Okay. Hearing a lot of horror stories there.
Yeah. Black Cat.
Oh, all right. Some of these are stories we're going to be touching on, no doubt.
Films of Vincent Price.
Films of Vincent Price, yeah. Certainly Edgar Allan Poe's influence down through the years has not only included authors, but yeah, filmmakers as well. Even for that matter, video games have been inspired by Edgar Allan Poe of all things. Now, as to the Raven right here, I imagine probably some of you would have said the Raven even without the obvious clue. Certainly one of the most famous poems in American literature. It does, by the way, also have the distinction of being the only poem to actually inspire the name of an NFL team. Of course, that being the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore is one city that, as well as Philadelphia, will claim his literary legacy, but there's actually a number of cities here in the mix because Edgar Allan Poe did live in a lot of different cities. Born in Boston, grew up in Richmond, spent some time in England as well in boarding school. He lived, again, in Baltimore. He lived in New York City and also Philadelphia. But I guess you could say that our claim to that literary legacy is that the majority of his best known stories, a number of which you have mentioned actually, like, for instance, The Telltale Heart and The Pit and the Pendulum, Mask of the Red Death, Fall of the House of Usher. These are all stories that he composed during his 6-year stint right here in the city. So this may sound a little cheesy, but we like to say here at the Edgar Allan Poe House that here in Philadelphia, or I should say, let me rephrase that, Baltimore may have the body, but here in Philadelphia, we have the body of work. All right, and with that, let's head on into the site itself, into the house.
Going up some stairs.
All right, so now we're inside the site, although in the 1840s, at the time when Edgar Allan Poe lived here, we still would have been outside. I don't know how well this picture is gonna show up so well on the camera, but this is a recently done artist rendering. By recently, I mean the last 40 years or so.
Which makes sense.
Artist rendering on how this
Is
property
doing-
would have looked at the time. So right now, Sarah and I are standing roughly about where Edgar Allan Poe is standing next to his wife, Virginia. There were actually, 3 official members of the Edgar Allan Poe household. I will explain why I threw in the word official there, because there was in fact an unofficial 4th member as well. So Edgar Allan Poe, his wife Virginia, and also his mother-in-law, Maria Clem, who proved to be a very capable, very able, and much needed caretaker, really, for the family. Virginia, I should explain, was actually quite ill at the time they lived here. She was suffering very badly from the disease tuberculosis. That's something we're probably going to mention a few times here throughout the tour. But as to the unofficial 4th member, Katerina, the family cat.
We did have a question about how long Poe lived in the house.
Oh, how long Poe lived in the house? Well, here, not especially long in the scheme of things. He was in Philadelphia 6 years overall, and he actually did live in a number of different places. He was a tenant at the time that he lived here, and for that matter, he was a tenant when he lived everywhere else, because he never actually owned his own property throughout his lifetime. But this is the only surviving Philadelphia residence for Poe, and it's also the last place he actually lived before he moved on. So he was only here for really about a year overall. We kind of think of it as being representative, really, of his entire stay here in the city. Yeah, I think it's probably a pretty good bet that the other houses, the other residences probably look similar. Maybe a little bit smaller though. What's going to allow him the means to actually move up here, because this was considered a pretty desirable property to live in at the time, was he had won a literary competition for writing his short story, The Gold Bug. This netted him a prize of $100, which was actually more money than he ever earned for any single work. And that was able to afford the rent on this house for up to a year. Now, as to what brought Poe to Philadelphia in the first place, why was he so transient? Why did he live in so many different places? Well, he was really trying to make a go of it in the publishing industry. Throughout his much of his adult life, he worked for literary magazines, contributing, many of his own stories. That's how a lot of his stories and poems actually did receive, their first publications. But also, he was a literary critic as well. He wrote, in fact, a lot of critical reviews, a lot of essays also. He was known for being something of a rather harsh critic. In fact, he even accuses fellow playwrights James Russell Lowell, as well as Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, actually accuses them of plagiarism, believe it or not. In fact, his criticisms were harsh to the point where he actually would eventually acquire the nickname, not that he comes up with this himself, but he eventually acquires the nickname, the Tomahawk Man. So, you can kind of perhaps get an idea how maybe that came about, because he was literally or figuratively, I should say, tomahawking into the work of his contemporaries. Now, that being said, he wasn't just, flat out cruel to everybody. He certainly did have favorites. He was actually a big fan of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So he tended to write very favorable criticisms of her work. As a matter of fact, his first publication of The Raven and other poems in book form, it's actually dedicated, in fact, to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now, we're about to step into the parlor here. This would have been the room that you were welcomed into if you were visiting Edgar or any other member of the Poe household for that matter. I'm just going to set you up a little bit here. It's going to be presented differently from how probably most historic homes would be that you may happen to visit these days. For one thing, the rooms are completely empty. And for that matter, the walls have been stripped down to the original layer of plaster. Now, a lot of different people moved in and out of this property after the time that Poe left here. So as you might be able to imagine, you know, the property is going to change a bit. In fact, between the time Edgar moved out of here in the early 1840s and the historic value of the site is finally a bit more fully appreciated in the 1920s, we estimate 9 different residents, which would include either individuals by themselves or living with their families, were actually in and out of this property. So when the National Park Service takes over the site, what they're going to do is strip off all the excess layers of plaster, again, to get to the original, and kind of gives it a little bit of a creepy look. In fact, the walls of the house might almost seem a little bit like, say, maybe from the story, The Fall of the House of Usher. I know that was one story that was mentioned earlier. So there's one step down here into the parlor. And just take a moment here to take in what you're seeing. Do any of you have any impressions at all? Anything come to mind as you look at these walls, at this space? Feel free to drop any observations into the chat.
It either looks damaged or unfinished.
Well, I will say here that even though a lot of people do kind of take to this look because, you know, it does sort of have this look of death and this look of decay, which is of course a theme of a number of Poe's stories, you could say, or fits in with the thematic material of much of his stories. But there are actually, some people who believe that that we should restore the house to make it appear a bit more like it did when Poe was the fact.
We got also depressing and unfinished.
Yeah.
Looks damaged.
Mm-hmm.
It is hard to see. The walls sort of look damaged, but also kind of on purpose.
Mm.
It does seem a little bit almost like if you tried to do this artistically, you wouldn't succeed as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I will say something that was done on purpose. I guess we could refer to this as historic graffiti. Not that I'm trying to say that there's, anything necessarily good about graffiti, but there's actually a word scrawled on the wall here. Might be a little tough to make it out. It's a 5-letter word. And it's also a word that may strike you as quite thematic.
Yep, death.
Death.
You got it.
Right. So, we don't know if Edgar Allan Poe himself scrawled it on the wall there or a later tenant did. Our curator, truth be told, thinks that a later tenant did. But either way, yes, it does definitely lend a certain aura to the site. And I will say every time I give a tour through this house, I always point it out to everybody. Now, another thing is, I know Sarah had the camera over here a moment ago, but another advantage to stripping the walls down to the original is it does allow us to play detective somewhat, appropriately so for a house that wherein once resided a man referred to as father of the detective story. But we know that this house used to actually have gas lighting. And right here against the wall is the, if you will, telltale sign of that. This is where a gas line used to run. Now, we do have a firsthand account from a friend of Poe's, a fellow author by the name of Mayne Reed, who writes that he enjoyed many pleasant evenings here in the house, you know, with his friend Edgar and the rest of his family as well. You know, there's of course an awful lot that we can discern from primary sources, and that's certainly a very good one for specifically for talking about what was going on here. But other things that you may want to check out, certainly something that's been of big help to me as well as a number of my colleagues who work over here is the Edgar Allan Poe Society. I believe it's eaposociety.org, and that's just a great source of finding primary resources. In fact, you can find the Poe log in its entirety on that website, and the Poe log gives almost kind of as much as could possibly be done a day-to-day accounts of Edgar Allan Poe's life. So, so that's certainly, if you're trying to do some research on your own, that's something that I would certainly recommend myself. All right, anything else in the chat?
Now we're continuing on.
Okay. All right, let's continue in the kitchen over here. And actually, as we come into this room, if you point the camera right above the door there, you can actually see some of the original wallpaper that was uncovered when the walls were stripped down. So if we ever do continue with the task of restoring it, we have some clues to go by there in terms of what the wall space would have been like. So this would have been the workspace here of Maria Clem before we entered the house. As I mentioned, she was a very capable caretaker of the family. And considering what the diet was, that's kind of a clue as to the fact that they really were on something of a shoestring budget, you might say. In fact, it's written that bread and molasses were kind of a regular staple here. If you can imagine having something like that night after night after night. You might kind of wonder, considering his wife was suffering from tuberculosis. In fact, she would only live for, I don't remember if I mentioned this already, but I think she would only live for 2 more years after they left this house. She passed away when they were living up in New York. And the fact that life was very hard in terms of being able to put food on the table, things like that. You might wonder, was it all worth it, for Poe? Did he ever have thoughts like that in his mind in terms of, should I try to find some sort of more of a stable income or thereabouts? So these are just things to consider. And you might want to even kind of think about that yourselves. Were you ever faced with a choice where you could follow your dream, but knowing that it would be a big risk to do so? If you ever in your life thought, gee, I might like to be a painter or an actor or something like that, but then considering things that you would have to sacrifice, and maybe stability would in fact be one of those sacrifices. Now, right around the corner here also, I know it says caution, do not use steps. Right through there is a stairway leading down to the cellar. We're actually going to finish the tour in the cellar. I know somebody mentioned the black cat as a Poe story, and we won't disappoint you. We're going to be talking about the black cat when we're actually down there. I don't want to give too much away in that regard, but there is really a specific reason as to why that is an ideal place, really, to go over the details of that story. All right, we're going to continue upstairs. So this room that we are in right now, it's a little bit of a mystery space. We're not really sure what Poe or any other member of the household would have used it for. Although there is a picture here of Poe writing alongside Katerina, who apparently was a pretty constant companion to Edgar while composing much of his stories. From what I've read, seems to have been a rather tame cat. In fact, a friend of Poe's came upon him once when he was engaged in writing and saw him with Katerina quite literally draped around his shoulders. Cats do come into play in a number of Poe's writings. I know we already mentioned the black cat. He also writes an essay prior to the black cat, but it's an essay called On Black Cats. And the inspiration for this was a cat that Poe actually owned prior to Katerina, which happened to have been a black cat. And really the purpose of this essay is he raises the question of can animals be rational creatures? Anything similar to how humans can be. And what really intrigues him about his black cat here is that she has mastered the art of working doorknobs and can let herself in and out of rooms. So yeah, that's something, you know, whenever I bring kids up here, that's something that I've taken to really, you know, bringing up with them. You know, can animals be rational creatures? You know, how old are people when they start to consider such things?
Has your cat mastered opening and closing the doors?
Mine personally has not. But yeah, I figure, you know, when especially with kids when they're high school age, I think it's kind of an interesting thing to bring up with them as something to consider.
Can we find that essay? What's the name of that essay?
Oh, it's called On Black Cats.
On
And again,
Black Cats.
that's not to be confused with The Black Cat. Very
Exactly.
different, very different writings there.
Thank you.
So I do have a question at this point, and that is, what are your school mascots? If you could take just one moment and put your school mascots in the chat. There's a specific
Lions,
reason why I'm asking
cougars,
this. Okay.
lions, oh my god, a Viking, pirates, lots of cats, lots of large cats, engineers, that's a new one.
Engineers, okay.
Oh, my partner would be very happy. Blue devils, generals, more cats. A rabbit. Eagles, very popular here. Black cats, cougars.
Okay.
All right, we got the whole of the large cat family.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was noticing a theme there.
Big cats all around.
Are big cats very popular in Kentucky? Is the
I guess
yeah.
so. I do appreciate the engineers,
Mhm.
Vikings. That was my high school.
Mhm.
No owl patriots, no owls. We're both temple owls, so.
That's right. Yeah.
Wildcats, green waves. All right.
Okay, so the reason why I was asking this is for an assignment that you can choose to do with your students, which is to ask them how their mascots, how your mascots can actually inspire their own writings, similar to how Poe's cat actually inspires him.
Apparently, cougar and black cat sightings are very common in Kentucky.
Oh, okay, good to know. In the wild, or?
I don't know, is it like Philadelphia where there's just random animals?
Okay. I should mention, by the way, that here at Edgar's house, what I've noticed over the years is that stray cats seem to have a propensity for coming out to the yard here. I'm not making this up, they really do. In fact, we've had a few colleagues, in fact, who have adopted some of the cats who have come in here. So anyway, if you actually do come to visit the Poe house in person, you know, maybe you could bring a cat carrier with you, because maybe you will be so inspired as well. All right, the next room will be Edgar's bedroom.
We are having some rather foul weather here. One of our people just told me, she sent me a picture of the hail that's happening outside her house. But
Oh,
she said it was,
no.
but she says perfect Poe weather.
Oh, perfect Poe weather.
So we may have some people that drop in and out because we're experiencing some kind of weird weather here in Kentucky.
We totally understand.
Well, this is recorded, right? So we can-
That's correct.
okay. All right, so now we are in Edgar's bedroom, and this room is the brightest room of the house. So we like to imagine, not that we can prove it, it's purely speculative, but we like to imagine that a lot of his composing was actually done here. As to what sort of composing he did, of course, we've already talked about a number of his stories, and we've talked about the fact that he wrote literary reviews and very imaginative essays, such as On Black Pants. But in terms of the stories himself, he really did cover a number of different genres. I mentioned downstairs, I just briefly mentioned, he referred to as father of the detective story. His short story Murders in the Rue Morgue, which was a story he actually wrote, again, while he was still living here in Philadelphia. This was considered quite a revolutionary story. In fact, the detective that he creates for this particular tale, a Frenchman, a Parisian detective by the name of C. Auguste Dupin, he actually serves as something of a prototype for another famous fictional detective that I'm sure you've all heard of, none other than Sherlock Holmes. In fact, the inventor of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle, gives Poe a lot of credit for this, and really pretty much flat out says in so many words that that Dupin was again an inspiration for him with creating this detective. I guess you could say by extension that if it were not for Edgar Allan Poe, perhaps there never would have been a Sherlock Holmes. And really, for that matter, think about all the detective novelists that certainly followed Arthur Conan Doyle. Also, he is considered an early pioneer of science fiction. He even inspired the novelist Jules Verne. Now, Poe himself did not write about spaceships, but I am bringing that up because he does write about some pretty fantastic voyages on hot air balloons. And in fact, well, that being said, I guess you could say this is sort of a spaceship of sorts. He writes a story called The Unparalleled Adventures of One Hans Fall, which is a story about a man who takes a balloon trip all the way to the moon. And when he arrives there, he even encounters aliens. Now, considering the story is published in 1838, this is, of course, long before writers like Verne or H.G. Wells, for that matter. So taking that into account, the fact in the 1830s, we have a writer here writing about a subject like aliens, you can certainly guess right there that that is quite ahead of its time. But then also we have to bring it back around to horror. Of course, he's some people might say he's most famous for horror tales above everything else. And certainly, judging by what you said in the chat early on, when you mentioned stories like The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher and The Pit and the Pendulum, that's perhaps what's on your minds too. Plus, also, I guess we're in the month of October. It's kind of tough not to mention things like that, stories like that. And in fact, a horror novelist who credits Poe quite a lot for his writings is none other than Stephen King. Stephen King will in fact say that The Telltale Heart is perhaps the greatest story of inside evil ever written. So my question for you is, and feel free to put this into the chat, it can just be yes or no, but you can certainly feel free to expound upon this if you like, is does Poe's versatility surprise you? Things that I mentioned, like the fact that he wrote in so many genres, like science fiction. Are these things that you were aware of? His versatility. What surprises you about that, if anything?
May they also turn on their mic and speak if they don't want to type in the chat?
Sure.
Okay. I will say I knew about the mysteries and the detective genres, but I didn't know about the other. So I think that's really interesting.
Science fiction, yeah.
Thought he was entirely horror, not sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Someone took an entire class on Stephen King. That must have been, did you sleep at all that semester? Didn't know about sci-fi. So the sci-fi seems to be the big surprise. You did. It was the favorite class. Yeah, it seems to be the surprise of science fiction. I'm always amazed how he continued on with so much tragedy in his life. He seemed to thrive from it.
Well, that is actually a good lead in to the next room, which would be his wife, Virginia's room. And it's up there that we're going to talk about Poe's poetry.
Still stuck on the fact that I had no idea that he lived in Philly. Well, he's around, he bumps around a lot.
Yes, that he does.
You have a extremely steep and narrow staircase that I will try not to fall down.
I wonder how many people on here didn't know he went to West Point.
Luckily, hoop skirts collapse pretty well, so I'd be more concerned about having to do it in heels. He flunked out of West Point, right?
He got expelled.
Expelled.
Now, I should add to that because there's been sort of a lot of salacious rumors about Poe, certainly regarding West Point, but really for that matter, you know, I could certainly open up and say a lot more than just that regarding the salacious rumors. But at West Point, in those days, if you were dissatisfied, you know, with, for whatever reason, you don't like the curriculum, you don't like the lifestyle, what have you, you could not just withdraw. You could not just drop out. So you actually had to find some way to get yourself expelled. So if you look at historical records regarding people who attended West Point in the early 19th century, there were actually people getting expelled left and right. So, you know, Poe does not stand out as anything peculiar, you know, when it comes to that. All right, so here we are in Virginia's room, and as I already mentioned earlier, she was suffering very badly from tuberculosis. This was a disease that she had actually that had actually hit her when she was 18, and she would live to be 24. And you know, very sad, tragic coincidence here. Edgar Allan Poe, at the age of 2, had actually lost his mother to the disease tuberculosis, and if that was not bad enough, it was also the same age, 24. Poe actually loses a lot of people in his life to this dreaded illness. His foster mother, Frances Allan, as well as John Allan, were actually Poe's foster parents. That's how he gets the middle name Allan, and they raise him in Virginia. Poe actually does no privilege, you might say, at this point, because the Allans are actually quite wealthy. But after Frances Allan passes, his relationship with John Allan, which had always been a bit on the tenuous side, disintegrates very quickly. So by the time Edgar Allan Poe is a young adult, by the time he's really pretty much in his early 20s, he's really pretty much left to his own devices from there on out. So he doesn't really have any financial support from John Allan. Now, of course, Edgar Allan Poe is going to go on to have, you know, quite a hard life, living, as I mentioned before, pretty much on a shoestring budget when he's you know, spending so much of his life with his wife and his mother-in-law, you know, here in Philadelphia, but certainly as well as other places as well. But indeed, I guess you could also say that it is going to inspire some of his best known writings. And, you know, how do we know this? Well, he pretty much says so in an essay he writes called The Poetic Principle, where he states, "The death of a young woman is perhaps the world's most poetical topic." And I think that is a real clue here into some of his best known writings. The fact that so many of them do in fact involve the subject, beautiful young women dying. And we've already talked about a few of these. Annabel Lee, that was mentioned earlier. And that's a poem, by the way, that many people believe to have been about Virginia, that Poe actually had Virginia in mind when he wrote that. And of course, we already talked about The Raven as well. The Fall of the House of Usher, of course, does have this theme. And a story that Poe himself considered to be his best work, we actually do know what he thinks his best work was, a short story called Ligeia. And this is a story about a man who does marry a beautiful young woman, I guess the love of his life. and she dies prematurely. The character does remarry, but he can never really quite recapture the same feelings of love for his second wife as he had for his first. At the end of the story, his first wife actually does return to him, but it's a little bit vague as to whether she literally has, or it is an opium-induced hallucination that he's having while he actually sees her. But anyway, poetry, certainly, this some of his best-known poems were inspired by these tragic occurrences. There was another poem he wrote called To Helen, by which he actually references Helen of Troy. And this is written about a woman who may have in fact been Poe's first love, although it was really kind of a boyhood crush, you might say. He had a crush on a lady by the name of Jane Stannard. This is when he was growing up in Richmond. She was actually about twice his age. And just to add a little bit of spice to that also, she was also his best friend's mother. But she will also, unfortunately, pass away at a very young age. She dies when she's only about 30. But To Helen is also a poem which is considered amongst a lot of fans of Poe's works to be certainly one of his best story, or one of his best poems. To return to horror here, the fact that so many people in Poe's life had passed away from this devastating illness, tuberculosis, a disease that was often referred to, or sometimes referred to as the quote living death. It likely inspired his writing of another horror story, another composition when he was living here in Philadelphia, Masque of the Red Death. This is set in medieval Europe, but people dying from this illness, the Red Death, was, as Poe actually describes it in the story, the symptoms seem to be kind of similar to what victims the way Poe describes the victims in the story are very similar to what people go through with tuberculosis. And further on the subject of horror, there's another story that we like to focus on here on the third level. This one, though, in the mother-in-law's room. And this is, in fact, none other than the Telltale Heart.
We did have a question about whether there is a video or virtual tour of this house. I know we have one for Independence Hall. I do not know whether we have one for this.
I don't think it's on our website, but it is on our Facebook page. So if you go to the Facebook page, which is actually a combination of the Park Service sites here in Philadelphia, and scroll back a bit, in fact, I think to October of last year, there's actually a group-led tour by which myself and 3 of my colleagues actually conduct the tour. So as to why we want to talk about the Telltale Heart here, well, for one thing, this is a story that takes place in a cramped apartment, similar to the one that we're in. And it's interesting to note too that when Poe is living in Philadelphia, his stories do tend to take on a bit more of a gritty and urban feel. Now, I know by what you put in the chat there that many of you are already familiar with the story, so I won't bog you down too much with the plot details. But of course, you probably remember that a man commits murder, carves the body up and puts it underneath the floorboards of his house. But I guess you could say that his conscience doesn't really let him get away with what he has done. And he believes he hears his murdered victim's heart beating underneath the floorboards. Very likely his conscience actually speaking back to him. If you look around the floor of the room that we're in, can we do that with the camera easily enough?
Yeah.
It may appear to you as if one of the floorboards can be removed. Anybody think they've seen it yet? You can put it in the chat if you think. It's there, it's there.
There we go. In the corner.
Ah, lo and behold, it has been discovered.
Oh, I guess our squeaky toy.
Yes, Yes, that's why we don't let any dogs up here. No, there are other reasons why we wouldn't allow that.
Cat toy. We did have a comment about how the house seems to be in a little bit of disrepair, and that the walls are left this way on purpose.
Mhm.
Anything that looks like there may have been, we live in Philadelphia. We get more rain than Seattle. Fun fact of the day, we get more rain in Seattle. So things that look like they are damaged might not be. They might just be the fact that it's a 200+ year old house. But
Yeah, think of this as stabilized decay. So in other words, we're not really doing anything to spruce it up, but we try to do whatever we can to keep it from crumbling further. We're actually not the only site in Philadelphia that has this idea with historic preservation. There's also Eastern State Penitentiary as well. A historic prison, which, by the way, I'll just add here, if you're coming up to Philadelphia to see our wonderful sites, apart from the Poe House, that's another one I'd recommend too. So, doing a little bit of free publicity for the Eastern State Penitentiary, I guess.
not a prison Poe ever spent time in.
No, he was never there.
Not that one.
He did not have that honor. Al Capone did, but not Edgar Allan Poe. Now it's often thought, I probably should address this here. This is kind of the ideal place to, as we've just talked about this story of a grisly murder. Because I often do get this comment here, as do a lot of my colleagues as well. Poe must have been really insane to have thought these things up. Well, it's important to note these stories didn't just burst from nowhere. The sign of some, a demented individual or anything like that. There was actually a story that we believe likely did inspire Poe to write this. A true story about a man who murders his daughter. I'm a little hazy on the details, but I think she was being courted by somebody that he did not approve of. So he actually murders his daughter, and in the courtroom, what's really kind of remarkable about his demeanor is that he manages to stay very calm and cool and relaxed. And it's interesting because the way that the Telltale Heart begins, and it's actually narrated by in first person. He actually himself talks about how calmly and coolly he can recollect all the facts of his particular story. Now, as to how we actually know that this individual, whose name, by the way, was James Wood, how we know this individual did have this demeanor in the courtroom. Well, Poe himself was actually the newspaper man, the journalist reporting on it. And that is, by the way, something else that you can find on that website that I spoke about earlier. So if you are curious to see that and actually make the connection there, that's actually kind of an interesting thing that you can do with your students as well. And that actually brings us probably a good time to bring this up in terms of activities that you can do with your students. Something that's been very successful here that we've done in the past. We refer to it as ripped from the headlines, by which we actually have students find real stories, just by, I was about to say flipping through newspapers, but I guess really flipping through the internet, find real stories. I guess you have to be careful there to find the real stories on the internet, but either way, kind of using that as the inspiration, for their own creative writing. That's something that even Poe himself did when he writes his short story, The Mystery of Mary Roget, which is, by the way, another one of the Auguste Dupin mysteries. But that's a story that he sets in France, but it's actually based off of a murder that happened in New York City, which was kind of a big story at the time. And Poe actually had a reason for doing this. He thought that by writing a fictional narrative of this true story, that he was going to himself solve the crime. He didn't, by the way, in case you're curious about that. All right, so are we ready for more horror?
We got some nods.
Some nods, okay.
Some nods, some thumbs up.
So I gave a little bit of a teaser earlier on
Always.
about the cellar. That is where we are going to conclude.
You're gonna get a very lovely view of the ceiling as I attempt to not die going down these stairs.
Probably more interesting than the back of my head.
Here, just be glad you don't have on a hoop skirt.
There are hoop skirts, at least they collapse. I've worn one.
Yeah,
The
you went.
challenge would be the shoes of the time certainly don't have the same traction as Ranger boots.
So as they travel, we looked online to see if the cool shirts they have in their gift shop that I got to see earlier are available online. But they're not. But we're going to go there if you're in Achieve this summer. So we'll go there and get our picture taken with the Raven, and we'll get us a Poe shirt. Yes, Ashley. Anybody in Aspire that does not get to go, let me know and we'll bring you a shirt back.
So what do you think here?
It's kind of creepy.
Yeah. The cobwebs and the spider webs, we actually purposefully leave them here. We just sort of let nature take its course. Adds quite a lot of ambiance.
Super dark and super creepy.
I could see a body being buried down there.
Well, since you brought it up, we will see the place where, at least in the story anyway, the body was buried.
Oh, but somebody else said it reminded them of the cask of
Amontillado.
Amontillado. Yeah, and I could see that too.
Well, that's a story that was, it was published shortly after Poe moved away from here. So he was perhaps thinking along similar lines here about trying to hide bodies in dark places below the earth. So the Black Cat is another story about an individual's descent into madness. In this case, it's alcohol that's actually his downfall. And to hear him tell his own story as a younger man, he was actually a very gentle, mild sort of soul. But as he does increasingly come under the influence of alcohol, he will end up being a very cruel person, and in fact will inflict some horrible injuries on his own poor pet cat, Pluto. So bit of a trigger warning if you're animal lovers, you might want to plug your ears at this point. In fact, one thing that he will do, and I should mention also, by the way, it's not that Pluto gets on his nerves because he's a mean or nasty cat. It's actually quite the opposite. He's actually a very affectionate cat. But the man, not thinking that he is very deserving of this affection, will be very irritated by Pluto, and at one point wanting to shun him and leave him alone. He will take a penknife out of his pocket and gouge out the cat's eye. But the empty eye socket here is a grim reminder of what he has done, and he can't really live with himself and knowing that that's happened, that he's done that. So in order to just banish Pluto altogether, he will hang him by a noose. Now, another cat will eventually come to live with him and his family, with his wife, that is. And yes, he is married and his wife has not left him throughout all this. But this other cat, he actually looks very similar to Pluto. He's all black with and missing an eye, but all black with one exception, and that is he has a little patch of white fur on his neck. And in this man's mind, this patch of white fur actually appears to be in the shape of a noose. So this could be his conscience kind of creeping up on him, or it could, for that matter, also be foreshadowing his eventual demise. One evening, when he's feeling particularly outraged, he has it in mind that he is going to murder this cat as well. This time, though, not with a noose, but rather with a hatchet. He's chasing the cat around the house with this hatchet, and his wife, actually, in this instance, plays the heroine. She steps in his way. She grabs his arm and is actually upraised with the hatchet. But then, unfortunately for her, as the cat scurries away, he pours all of his rage and all of his venom on her instead. And as Poe very graphically describes in the story, I buried the hatchet into her brain. Now, following this gruesome action right here, he comes up with an idea, kind of similar to what the guy did in The Telltale Heart. He comes up with an idea that he wants to cover all traces of his crime. And he's taken note of the fact that in his cellar, there's a feature referred to as a false chimney. And it's got bricks missing from the front of it, just like this one here, and a hollow cavity. And so he thinks, if I just put the corpse of my wife right here in the hollow cavity and layer up bricks, kind of similar to Cask of Amontillado, as we were talking about a moment ago, but layer up bricks, nobody will ever be any the wiser that there's actually a body on the other side. Now, 4 days later, the police actually pay a visit to his home. It has been reported his wife has not been seen out and about, and he is so confident that he has gotten away with the perfect crime here that he actually invites them in. And he says, sure, by all means, explore the house. And they do, and they actually seem satisfied. And they're getting ready to leave, but just before they go, he gets really quite arrogant, because from his perspective, he has successfully pulled the wool over the authorities' eyes here. So he decides to really push his luck to the hilt. So he takes them down to the cellar and he says, excuse me, officers, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we live in a very well-built and well-constructed house. Take, for instance, this false chimney, how well-built and how well-constructed it is. And he gives the bricks a rap, like so. But upon doing so, he hears a moan coming from the other side. And within moments, the arms of the police are all around the false chimney, tearing the bricks down. And once they have done so, they discover on the other side, one, the rotting corpse of his wife, but also seated on the corpse's head with red tongue hanging out and singular eye of fire. All right, scared yet? Don't tell me you've fallen asleep on the other end.
Oh, no, they're having fun.
All right. So it
Good
is
laugh.
interesting.
We got some Pet Cemetery.
Pet Cemetery.
There is a question in the chat. How many kids have you scared with that?
How many? Oh, I've lost count a long time ago. Yeah.
All right, we are.
But, you know, I will say also, a lot of times adults get just as scared. Now, of course, you don't just, you know, need a creepy basement to inspire you in your storytelling. One activity that we like to do with, thank you. One activity that we really like to do with kids is the two-sentence story, a two-sentence scary story, that is. And that's something that we've done with a writer's camp that we bring here every summer. And, you know, it's something the kids, they do have a whole lot of fun with. It's simple to do, and they're very imaginative. Some of the things that I've heard in the past, like for instance, I remember one girl said, I looked in the mirror to brush my teeth, and all I saw was a bloody stump on my shoulders. That's one that always that always sticks out to me. So that is something that you can do with the kids to kind of enliven their imaginations a bit. But I just noticed the time, and I know that we're kind of running a bit short here. But we'll finish up in the reading room. So we'll say a few more things in closing, and if there's any time, we'll take questions.
We need to hear about the Kentucky tragedy.
Yeah. The writers camp sounds interesting.
Yeah. One loose end that I want to tie up, by the way, because I had mentioned before about Poe as the Tomahawk Man and accusing his fellow poets of plagiarism. There was one writer who actually took rather egregious offense to Poe, to a slight that he had received from Poe. His name was Rufus Griswold. And he's actually going to take out his revenge in kind of a vicious way. He's going to do an awful lot to actually harm Poe's reputation after he passes. He's going to spread a lot of lies about him. But what makes this particularly egregious is that a lot of things that he said about Poe, and perhaps these are some things that you may have heard yourself, like, for instance, being a womanizer, a drug addict, addicted to gambling. These are all things that he actually made up and spread about Poe. And yeah, it is amazing just the damage that one person can inflict there. All right, so this is the reading room, and often when people visit the home, this is kind of a nice place for them to finish up the tour. They can actually relax on the furnishings, and we even have a CD player, which in itself seems to be turning in, or ought to be a museum piece. I think we're going to get it replaced by a MP3 player. But we actually have on the CD works of Poe being read by people like Vincent Price. I know, his name was mentioned earlier. The Kentucky tragedy. Yes, I'm glad that you brought that up. In fact, I thought of that, knowing that we were going to be speaking to people from Kentucky. I got kind of excited about the prospect of this. To return to the subject about real life stories actually inspiring Poe, Poe was rather intrigued, as actually a lot of people were, because it was kind of a big story of its day, of a scandal that happened in Kentucky during the 1820s. Now, it's a very easy story to find out about. In fact, if you Google Kentucky tragedy, it'll probably be like the third or fourth thing that actually comes up. Where it inspired Poe is he is with the one play that he actually wrote. He wrote a play called Pollution, although he never actually finished it. Not really sure why he didn't, because he actually wrote it in the mid 1830s, so well over 10 years before his death. So who knows? Maybe he just gave up on it. But either way, he actually sets this play in Italy, several hundred years, certainly prior to his lifetime. But what did inspire him to write this was actually this story that happened in Kentucky. And in this story, a politician by the name of Solomon Sharp has an affair with a planter's daughter. Her name was Anna Cook. And in fact, she becomes pregnant. But after this, he basically shirks all responsibility whatsoever, claims that the child is not his. He has his own family. He's married with children. And she eventually gives birth. The child is born stillborn, but she is going to try and seek revenge. And she does this by using another individual who has fallen in love with her, a man named, and I have to admit, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his first name right, Jeroboam Beauchamp. And he's also a lot younger than Miss Cook, but he's quite smitten by her. And so she agrees that she will marry him on one condition, and that condition is that she has to kill Mr. Sharp, who at this point he was the Attorney General of Kentucky. So Beauchamp does actually murder Sharp. He stabs him to death, and he is caught afterwards. He eventually confesses to his crime. And he's sentenced to death. And in fact, he becomes, I think, the first execution by hanging in the state of Kentucky. This happens in the mid 1820s. So for the historians listening, you may be interested in that. Now, another thing is, for the English teachers, if you want to introduce this story by using pollution, that's there might be a better alternative, with all due respect to Edgar Allan Poe, because Robert Penn Warren actually wrote a novel about this as well. So that's maybe another approach that you can take. And I only say that because reading a half-written a half-written play just may not be the most gripping way to bring your students in. All right, so
Yeah,
do you
so
have any other questions or comments or anything else, concerns? I know there seemed to be a lot of concern about the house falling apart. We don't want to reenact the fall of the House of Usher too literally.
There are some resources on that agenda that we didn't get today, but feel free to go and look at those. There are 2 evaluations. I just posted them in the chat. They're both at the bottom of that active agenda as well. The National Park Service would like you to complete an evaluation for them to use. And then there, of course, is our sign-in evaluation. And you need to complete that sign-in evaluation for us to get credit for our time this evening. And then I'm going to quit talking and let you ask questions if you have any. There's one in the chat right now. How was Poe's marriage viewed at the time?
Well, tough question to answer because, and for those of you who may not be in the know about this, Poe got married when he was in his late 20s. Virginia was only 13. And on top of that, she was also his first cousin. Now, it's the sort of thing that I think at the time it was more acceptable than today, but that's also not to suggest that it was necessarily acceptable in all social circles. But I know that when they got married in Virginia, it was actually illegal to marry somebody that young. And so they actually lied on the wedding certificate. And this was in Richmond where they got married. They lied on the wedding certificate claiming that she was 21. So 13-year-old passing for someone who's 21. I can imagine people in attendance probably look the other way on that one.
many thanks.
So,
All right.
well, thank you for watching.
We'll yeah, so hi from and bye from Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site.
Yes.
If there are any follow-ups,
Sarah, we
yes.
do have a question. So the
Sure.
evaluation you sent us is just a Google Doc.
yes.
And they're asking how you would like them to complete that. So would you like them to, what would you like them to do so that you get that data?
You can copy it and email it. That sounds great. Yeah.
So just if you want to email it to me and then I will email it to you because they don't necessarily have your email address.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely. That works just fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right.
So
Well, thank
very-
you all.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. I loved it. We just enjoyed it so much. So more like this to come, folks. We're so glad that you all were here and we thank you and we have a good evening and be safe in this kind of crazy weather.
Yes, do stay safe.
Thanks. Happy
Thank
Halloween.
you, Paul. Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic job.
Thanks, guys.